Welcome aboard the interstellar starship Genesis. Together, we'll journey beyond the boundaries of known space, explore distant worlds, and witness the quiet wonders of the universe. If you enjoy relaxing sci-fi sleep stories like this, please consider liking this video and subscribing to join us on future voyages. Now find a comfortable place to rest. Take a slow, gentle breath, and whenever you're ready, let the journey begin. Chapter 1. The Change. The first sign was not an alarm. It was the way my feet touched the floor. I stepped out of my cabin as I did every morning, expecting the familiar weight beneath me. Instead, my first step carried slightly farther than it should have. Not much, just enough to make me stop. I looked down at the floor. Everything appeared normal. The corridor was unchanged. The lights were still following their gradual morning cycle. Air moved quietly through the ventilation system. Somewhere deeper inside Genesis, machinery continued its steady hum. But my body knew something was different. I took another step. The sensation was subtle. My legs felt lighter. My balance felt slightly delayed. For a moment, I wondered whether I was simply tired. Then someone farther down the corridor dropped a tool. It struck the floor with a softer impact than expected. The tool bounced once, then settled. Nobody said anything. A few seconds later, another crew member tried to walk normally and nearly overextended a step. That was when the first message came through from the bridge. The artificial gravity was changing. Genesis had been designed around a rotating habitation ring. The ring turned continuously, creating the gentle acceleration that kept our bodies pressed toward the floor. At normal operating speed, it produced approximately 8/10 of Earth's gravity. We had lived with it for decades. Most of us no longer thought about it. Gravity had become part of the background of life aboard Genesis. Something as ordinary as air. Something you noticed only when it wasn't behaving normally. Navigation confirmed that the ship's overall trajectory had not changed. Genesis was still traveling exactly as planned. The problem was local to the habitation ring. Its rotational speed had begun to decrease. Engineering was already investigating. There was no emergency. The ring was still turning. The systems controlling it remained stable. But the rotation was slowing, and that meant the artificial gravity was becoming weaker. I walked toward the nearest observation area. With every step, the difference became a little easier to notice. The floor no longer seemed quite as firmly beneath me. I reached the window and stood there for a moment. Outside, the universe looked exactly the same. Stars remained fixed against the darkness. Genesis continued moving through interstellar space. Nothing about the view suggested that anything had changed. But inside the ship, something fundamental had. For decades, Genesis had created a small piece of Earth around us, a place where humans could stand, walk, sleep, work, grow food, live normally while traveling between the stars. Now that artificial gravity was beginning to weaken, we were about to discover just how much of ordinary human life depended on it. And none of us yet knew how low the gravity would fall. Chapter 2. The Investigation. By the time I reached the bridge, the change was no longer something we could dismiss as fatigue. The artificial gravity was still weakening. Navigation had already confirmed that Genesis was following its planned trajectory. The ship itself was moving normally through interstellar space. Only the rotation of the habitation ring had changed. Engineering was already working through the first diagnostics. The ring was enormous compared with the rest of Genesis, rotating around the central structure that connected the ship's major sections. Its rotation had been carefully maintained for decades. A precise rotational speed was required to produce the artificial gravity we had become accustomed to. Now that speed was falling. The difference was small, but it was measurable. Engineering checked the systems controlling the ring and found no immediate mechanical failure. The motors were responding. The power supply remained stable. The structural monitoring systems showed no abnormal stress. Nothing appeared to be breaking. That was what made the problem difficult. There was no obvious failure to repair. The ring was simply losing rotational speed. Navigation independently monitored the change. The measurements from the bridge agreed with engineering's readings. The artificial gravity was falling, slowly, but continuously. A message was sent through the ship asking the crew to avoid unnecessary movement between the rotating sections until the cause was understood. There was no reason to panic. The gravity was still strong enough for normal movement. But everyone aboard Genesis was beginning to notice the difference. A few hours later, the change was impossible to ignore. Objects took longer to settle. Walking required less effort. Even sitting down felt slightly different. The ship had not become weightless. It simply wasn't holding us as firmly to the floor as it had that morning. Engineering continued tracing the problem through the rotation system. The control system was compensating for the decreasing rotational speed by increasing the power supplied to the ring. For a while, that worked. Then the rotational speed began falling again. The system was reaching the limit of what it could compensate for. Engineering could increase the power further, but doing so would place additional stress on components that had already been operating continuously for decades. The safer option was to allow the ring to stabilize at a lower rotational speed while the engineers continued their investigation. It wasn't the outcome anyone wanted, but it was the safest one. Genesis would continue moving through interstellar space. The ring would continue turning. The ship would continue producing artificial gravity. Just less of it. And for the first time in decades, the crew of Genesis would have to learn what it was like to live with a little less weight beneath their feet. Chapter 3: Living Lighter. By the second day, the change had become part of the rhythm of the ship. Genesis was still producing artificial gravity. There was simply less of it. At first, we noticed the difference when we walked. A normal step carried us slightly farther than expected. Standing up required less effort. Turning around felt subtly different, as though our bodies were taking a fraction longer to understand where the floor was. Nothing was difficult. Nothing was dangerous. It was simply unfamiliar. A cup placed on a table still stayed where it belonged, but lifting it felt different. A tool released from the hand took slightly longer to settle. Someone stepping over a threshold found themselves rising a little higher than expected before returning to the floor. The changes were small enough that we could have ignored them. But after decades aboard Genesis, even small changes were noticeable. We had lived with the same artificial gravity for so long that our bodies had stopped distinguishing it from normal gravity. Now they were being reminded that it wasn't. The difference became more obvious when we moved through the ship. The habitation ring continued rotating around the central sections of Genesis. The ring provided most of the artificial gravity in the areas where we lived. The central sections did not rotate with it. For years, moving between those areas had been routine. Now the transition felt different. You could leave the rotating habitat and enter a section where there was almost no apparent weight. Then, after returning through the transfer system, the gentle pull of the ring would gradually become noticeable again. It made us aware of something we had forgotten. Gravity was not everywhere aboard Genesis. We had built it into part of the ship, and now that system was changing. Hydroponics noticed the difference as well. The plants were still growing. The irrigation systems were still functioning. But the lower rotation changed the way water moved through the growing systems. The hydroponics crew adjusted the circulation controls and began monitoring the plants more closely. Nothing had failed. The system simply had to operate under conditions it had not been designed to maintain indefinitely. Life support was watching its own systems for similar changes. Air still circulated through the habitation areas, but reduced rotation altered the way fluids and gases behaved within the ship. The environmental systems compensated automatically. They'd been designed with changing conditions in mind, but Genesis had never been intended to remain at a reduced rotational speed for years. That distinction was beginning to matter. For the crew, the strangest part was how ordinary everything still looked. Meals continued. Work continued. People walked through the corridors. The ship continued moving through the darkness between the stars. Nothing about Genesis looked broken, yet our relationship with the floor beneath us had changed. The human body expects resistance when it moves. It expects weight when it lifts something. It expects the floor to push back when a foot comes down. We had never needed to think about any of that. Earth had provided it without asking. Genesis had been providing it too, until now. And as the days passed, we began to understand that the question facing us wasn't simply whether humans could function with less gravity. The more difficult question was waiting further ahead. What would happen if the body had to live this way for a very long time? Months, years, perhaps an entire voyage. Genesis had been built to carry human beings between the stars, but we were beginning to wonder whether the environment we had created inside the ship was truly enough to keep the human body healthy, or whether we had simply assumed that it would be. Chapter 4. What gravity does. Until the rotation began to change, gravity had been one of the easiest things aboard Genesis to ignore. It was always there. Every morning when we woke, it was there. Every time we stood from a chair, carried a tool, or walked through a corridor, our bodies were working against it. We had never needed to think about why. Earth had trained the human body for gravity, long before humans understood what gravity was. Our muscles had developed beneath it. Our bones had strengthened beneath it. Our balance had evolved around it. Even the way we moved through a room depended on knowing that the floor would remain beneath us. Genesis had recreated part of that environment, but it had never recreated Earth itself. The artificial gravity produced by the rotating ring was an acceleration. Our bodies experienced the effect as weight, but there was no planet beneath the floor. There was only the movement of the ship. That distinction had never mattered much during normal operations. Now it did. The medical systems began monitoring the crew more closely, not because anyone was sick, because the change in gravity meant the forces acting on our bodies were changing as well. Our muscles were receiving less loading. Our bones were receiving less mechanical stress. Our cardiovascular systems were working against a slightly different environment. None of these changes were dramatic over a single day. That was the problem. The human body does not transform overnight. The effects of reduced gravity accumulate slowly. That made the question difficult to answer. If we spent a few days at lower gravity, there was little reason to expect serious consequences. But Genesis wasn't a short mission. We were living aboard a ship designed to cross interstellar distances. If the rotation remained below its normal operating level for months, the situation would be different. If it remained that way for years, it would be different again. We knew what happened to humans during prolonged exposure to microgravity. Muscles weakened, bones lost density. The cardiovascular system adapted to a different workload. Balance and spatial orientation changed. The body itself began adjusting to an environment where weight was no longer part of everyday life. But Genesis was not at microgravity. We were somewhere between Earth gravity and weightlessness, and that was where our knowledge became less certain. How much gravity was enough? There was no simple number. We had models, we had experiments, we had observations from astronauts who had spent long periods in orbit. But no human being had spent decades living at partial gravity inside a rotating spacecraft. No one could tell us with certainty what would happen to a human body after years at a fraction of Earth's gravity. Genesis was entering territory that humanity had studied only in theory. The medical crew began establishing a new baseline for everyone aboard: strength, balance, movement, cardiovascular response, bone health. Nothing was treated as an emergency. The measurements were simply recorded. We needed to know how our bodies responded if the reduced gravity continued. That changed the atmosphere aboard the ship. The lower gravity was no longer just an engineering problem. It had become a biological one. Engineering was trying to understand how long the ring could operate below its normal rotation. Life support was monitoring the environment. Hydroponics was watching the plants. Navigation continued monitoring Genesis's course, and the medical systems were watching us. Every department was looking at the same problem from a different direction. How much could Genesis change before the people living inside it began to change too? That question stayed with me as I walked through the habitation ring that evening. The floor was still beneath my feet. The lights were still warm. The air still smelled faintly of the plants growing several modules away. Everything about the ship still felt like home. But home was changing around us, and for the first time, we had to consider something that no generation before ours had ever been forced to answer. If humans were going to live between the stars for decades, what would happen when the gravity of home was no longer enough? Chapter 5. The ring stops. The decision came quietly. There was no alarm, no sudden loss of power, no violent movement through the ship. Engineering simply informed the bridge that the rotation could no longer be maintained safely. The ring would have to stop. For a few moments, nobody responded. We had spent the previous days adjusting to less gravity. Now we were about to experience none. The ring had been turning for decades. It had become one of the most fundamental systems aboard Genesis. As long as it rotated, the outer habitation sections gave us a direction that felt like up and down. The floor was beneath us. The ceiling was above us. Objects stayed where we placed them. Our bodies knew how to move through the ship. When the rotation stopped, all of that would change. Engineering began reducing the rotational speed gradually. The difference was immediate. The gentle pressure beneath our feet weakened. Then it weakened again. Walking became more difficult. A normal step no longer carried us toward the floor with the same certainty. People began holding onto handrails. Tools were secured. Loose equipment was checked. Hydroponics began shutting down portions of its normal circulation systems and securing the growing areas for microgravity operation. Life support adjusted its monitoring as the atmosphere inside the rotating sections approached the same condition as the central modules. Genesis was becoming one environment. There was no longer a rotating section, creating artificial gravity around us. The ring slowed further. The sensation was strange. My feet were still touching the floor. Then they weren't. I pushed away slightly without meaning to. My body rose. There was no falling back. I reached for the nearest handhold and pulled myself toward the wall. Around me, the same thing was happening. Throughout the habitation ring, people were floating. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no sound to mark the moment. Genesis simply became weightless. The ring continued turning for another few seconds. Then the final rotational motion disappeared. The ship stopped creating artificial gravity. For the first time since Genesis left Earth, there was no floor beneath us. There was no ceiling either. There were only surfaces we could hold on to, and the direction we chose to move. I pushed gently away from the wall. My body drifted across the compartment. A movement that would have taken one step on Earth carried me several meters through the air. I stopped myself against another handrail. The sensation was unlike anything I had experienced aboard Genesis. The ship still felt familiar. The walls were the same. The lights were the same. The air was the same. But the relationship between my body and everything around me had disappeared. Gravity had always provided a quiet reference. It told us which way was down. It told us where objects would go when we released them. It told our muscles how much force to use. Now there was no down. For a while, nobody spoke. We were all learning the same simple lesson. Without gravity, the ship did not become empty. It became three-dimensional. Every surface could become a floor. Every direction could become a path. And every movement had to be deliberate. Genesis had been designed to cross interstellar space. Now we were going to discover whether the human body could truly live that way for an extended period. Not for a few hours, not for a few days, for as long as the ring remained still. And none of us knew what that would do to us. Chapter 6. Living without weight. The first few hours were the easiest. Our bodies still remembered how to move through the ship. We reached for handholds. We pushed gently from one surface to another. We learned to stop ourselves before reaching a wall. Simple movements became deliberate. A turn of the shoulder could send the body drifting in another direction. A careless push could carry someone across an entire compartment. On Earth, movement was constantly corrected by gravity. You stepped forward, and the floor stopped your downward motion. You sat down, and the chair supported your weight. You dropped something, and it fell. Inside Genesis, none of those things happened anymore. A tool released from the hand simply remained where it was. A loose object could drift through a compartment until someone caught it. Even sleeping required a different approach. There was no weight pressing us into a mattress. Instead, sleeping restraints held the body in place while the ship continued its journey around us. The first night felt strangely peaceful. There was no sense of falling, no pressure against the body, just the quiet hum of Genesis and the sensation of floating inside a darkened cabin. But the practical problems appeared quickly. Meals had to be prepared differently. Liquids could no longer be poured in the familiar way. A drink released from a container formed a floating mass rather than flowing downward. Food had to be secured before it was opened. Even simple tasks required more planning. The crew adapted. Humans are good at that. We began using the ship differently. Handholds became pathways. Walls became places to push from. Storage compartments were reorganized so that equipment could not drift away when opened. Engineering secured anything that could become a loose object. A small item that would have fallen harmlessly onto the floor on Earth could now disappear into a ventilation system. That meant every department had to think differently about ordinary work. Engineering modified procedures for maintenance. Life support monitored the movement of fluids through systems that had been designed with gravity and rotation in mind. Hydroponics faced the greatest challenge. Plants had evolved with gravity, just as we had. Their roots no longer had a natural direction to grow toward. Water no longer moved through growing systems in the familiar way. The hydroponics crew had prepared for reduced gravity, but true microgravity was different. They began adjusting circulation and support systems while carefully monitoring the plants. The ship remained functional, but everything required more attention. That was perhaps the strangest part of living without gravity. Nothing had to be difficult. It simply could no longer be taken for granted. Moving through the ship became a skill. You learned how hard to push, how quickly you would drift, how to stop yourself, how to work without allowing a tool to float away. After several days, the crew became more comfortable. We could move through Genesis without thinking about every motion, but our bodies were beginning to tell us something else. Without gravity, there was no need to support our weight. The muscles that normally worked throughout the day were doing less. Our bones were carrying almost none of the load they had evolved to carry. The cardiovascular system no longer had to work against a constant downward pull. The changes were not immediately visible. That was what concerned us. The ship could remain weightless for a day, a week, even longer. But Genesis had not been designed for a crew to live in microgravity indefinitely. And now the question that had been theoretical for generations had become something we were experiencing ourselves. How long could the human body remain healthy without gravity? We didn't have the answer. We only knew that the experiment had begun. And for the first time, the entire crew understood that the longer the ring remained still, the more important that answer would become. Chapter 7. The Human Body. The first week without gravity passed more easily than some of us expected. That was almost reassuring. We had learned how to move through Genesis. We had learned to sleep without a mattress beneath us. We had learned to secure our food, our tools, and anything else that might otherwise drift away. The ship had adapted, so had we. But adaptation was not the same as health. The medical systems had been monitoring us from the moment the ring stopped. At first, the measurements showed very little. Our bodies were still carrying the memory of gravity. Muscles that had been used for walking and standing for decades did not disappear simply because the floor had stopped pulling against our feet. Our bones did not immediately change. Our hearts did not suddenly behave differently. The human body was carrying its history with it, but that history was beginning to become less useful. Without gravity, our muscles no longer had to support our weight. The muscles of the legs and lower body were doing far less work. The back and hips were no longer constantly resisting the downward force they had been built around. Even ordinary movement through Genesis required less strength. That sounded convenient. It wasn't. The body maintains what it needs. When a muscle is no longer required to perform a certain amount of work, it begins to reduce itself. The same principle applied to our bones. Bone is living tissue. It responds to mechanical loading. On Earth, every step tells the skeleton that it needs to remain strong enough to support the body. In microgravity, that signal becomes much weaker. We began exercising more, not because anyone aboard Genesis had suddenly become an athlete, because exercise had become part of our medical routine. Resistance systems were brought into regular use. The crew spent more time working against artificial loads, trying to give our muscles and bones something resembling the forces they were accustomed to. It helped, but nobody could tell us how completely it would compensate for the absence of gravity. That was the problem. We knew how the body responded to short and extended periods in microgravity. We knew that exercise could reduce some of the effects, but Genesis was not an orbital laboratory. We weren't planning to return to Earth after a few months. We were traveling between stars. If the ring remained still, our exposure would continue. Weeks would become months. Months could become years, and the human body would continue adapting. Another change became noticeable during our medical examinations. Without gravity pulling fluids toward the lower parts of the body, more fluid remained toward the chest and head. Some of us noticed it as pressure. Others simply felt different. The body was redistributing itself around an environment it had never evolved to inhabit. Even balance became strange. On Earth, the inner ear provides information that helps the brain understand orientation. Gravity gives that system a constant reference. In microgravity, that reference disappears. At first, the brain doesn't know what to do with the conflicting information. Then it begins learning. That was perhaps the most remarkable part. The human body was not simply failing without gravity. It was adapting. Our brains were learning a new way to understand movement. Our muscles were adjusting to a different workload. Our cardiovascular systems were adapting to a world without a constant downward pull. Our bones were responding to the absence of mechanical stress. We were becoming different, not suddenly, not visibly, but gradually. And that was what concerned us. A few days without gravity was an experience. A few weeks was an experiment. But years would be something else entirely. No human being had lived an entire adult life without gravity. No one knew what the final result would look like. We could exercise. We could monitor our health. We could adjust our environment. But none of those measures could answer the question that had begun to occupy the crew. How much of the human body could change before returning to gravity became a problem of its own? If our muscles weakened, if our bones became less dense, if our balance adapted to weightlessness, what would happen when we eventually stood beneath a planet again? For the first time, the destination ahead of Genesis seemed to matter for another reason. We had always thought about whether the ship could reach another world. Now we had to think about whether our bodies would still be prepared to stand on one. Chapter 8. The Ship Without Gravity. The changes inside Genesis were not limited to our bodies. The ship had been designed around gravity too. We simply hadn't realized how many systems depended on it. For decades, the rotating habitation ring had provided a familiar direction. Water moved toward the lowest part of a container. Loose objects settled. Condensation behaved predictably. Waste moved through systems designed around a consistent orientation. Even something as simple as placing an object on a shelf depended on gravity to keep it there. Now none of that could be assumed. Engineering began reviewing systems throughout Genesis that had never been designed to operate indefinitely without artificial gravity. The first problems appeared in the water systems. Liquid no longer settled naturally inside tanks and reservoirs. Instead, it gathered against surfaces through a combination of surface tension and air pressure. A tank that had once had an obvious top and bottom no longer behaved that way. Sensors had to determine where the liquid actually was. Pumps had to move it deliberately. The same problem appeared in other parts of the ship. A small amount of water released accidentally could become a floating sphere. It would not fall toward a drain. It would remain suspended until it contacted another surface. That made even minor leaks more complicated. Life support increased monitoring throughout the habitation modules. Air itself was not simply disappearing into space. The ship remained sealed, but without the normal effects of rotation, the movement of air and other fluids depended much more heavily on mechanical circulation. Fans and pumps became even more important. Genesis had always used them. Now they were doing work that gravity had quietly helped with before. Waste systems required similar attention. Nothing moved, simply because it was heavier than something else. Every transfer had to be controlled. Every pump had to perform its job correctly. There was no downward direction waiting to help. Engineering began securing equipment that had previously been considered safe simply because it was resting on a surface. Tools were tethered. Storage compartments were reorganized. Small components were accounted for before maintenance began. A dropped screw was no longer a screw that fell onto the floor. It was a piece of metal that could drift into an air intake, disappear behind a panel, or remain suspended somewhere inside the ship until someone found it. The absence of gravity had turned ordinary maintenance into a different kind of work. Hydroponics faced an even more complicated problem. The plants were still alive, but they were no longer growing in an environment that behaved naturally. Roots had no gravitational direction to follow. Water had to be delivered directly. Gas exchange around the leaves changed. The hydroponics crew adjusted circulation and support systems while monitoring the plants for signs of stress. Some adapted better than others. That was another reminder that Genesis was not just carrying a collection of machines through space. It was carrying an ecosystem. And that ecosystem had been designed around a particular environment The longer we remained weightless, the more obvious that became. Genesis could function without gravity, but functioning was not the same as operating normally. The ship had redundancy. It had pumps, fans, sensors, control systems, procedures for almost every failure we could imagine. But those systems had been designed to support a crew living with artificial gravity. Now they were being asked to replace it. Everywhere we looked, the same pattern appeared. Gravity had never been listed as a component on a maintenance schedule. It had simply been part of the environment. We had built the ship around it without realizing how deeply it was woven into everything we did. That realization changed the way engineering approached the problem. Restarting the ring was no longer only about making the crew comfortable again. It was about restoring the environment the ship itself had been designed to operate within. And after weeks without rotation, the question became increasingly difficult to avoid. How long could Genesis continue this way before the absence of gravity became more than the crew could safely tolerate? The answer would depend on more than the machines. It would depend on us. Chapter 9. Gravity. By the time engineering was ready to restart the ring, we had been living without artificial gravity long enough for weightlessness to feel almost ordinary. That was perhaps the strangest part. At first, every movement had required thought. Now we moved through Genesis almost naturally. We pushed from handholds. We caught ourselves before reaching a wall. We secured tools before beginning maintenance. We slept suspended in our restraints. We had adapted. But the medical readings had also made one thing clear. Adaptation did not mean that the human body no longer needed loading. Our muscles were changing. Our bones were responding to the absence of weight. The cardiovascular system was adapting to a different environment. Exercise could slow some of those changes, but it could not recreate everything that gravity had provided. The longer we remained weightless, the more uncertain the future became. Engineering had reached the same conclusion from another direction. Genesis could continue operating without the ring. But the ship had been designed around artificial gravity. Water systems were more complicated. Hydroponics required additional management. Maintenance procedures had changed. Life support was carrying more of the work that gravity had once helped with. The ship could survive without the ring. The question was whether it should. The answer was becoming clear. We needed gravity again. Engineering began the restart sequence slowly. The ring would not return to its normal rotation immediately. The process had to be gradual. A sudden increase in rotational speed would subject the structure and the crew to forces they had not experienced for weeks. The first movement was almost imperceptible. The ring began turning. At first, nothing seemed different. Then I felt it. A slight pressure against my body. My feet drifted toward what had once been the floor. I reached out and placed them against it. For the first time in weeks, the floor was beneath me. The sensation was almost overwhelming in its familiarity. We continued increasing the rotation. The pressure grew. Not much, just enough to make standing easier. The crew moved cautiously through the habitation ring as the artificial gravity returned. The sensation changed with every adjustment. At a certain point, walking became possible again. It felt strange. The same corridors, the same floor, the same walls, but our bodies had changed during the weeks without weight. What had once felt completely normal now required effort. We continued until the ring reached its normal operating speed. The artificial gravity stabilized. Genesis was home again. But the experience had changed the way we understood the ship. Before the failure, gravity had been invisible to us. We noticed it only because it was always there. After weeks without it, we understood how much depended on that simple acceleration. Our bodies needed loading. The ship's systems benefited from predictable fluid behavior. Hydroponics relied on carefully controlled environmental conditions. Daily life itself had been built around having a direction that meant down. Artificial gravity was not a luxury. It was part of the environment that made long-term human habitation possible. But there was another lesson. We'd spent weeks in true microgravity and survived. We had adapted. We had learned how to work, sleep, eat, and move through the ship without weight. Human beings were more adaptable than we had assumed. The question was no longer whether people could live without gravity for a short time. They could. The harder question remained unanswered. How long could they remain healthy that way? Months? Years? An entire lifetime? Humanity still did not know. Genesis had given us another piece of the answer. Not enough to settle the question, just enough to understand how much we still had to learn. Later that evening, I stood inside the habitation ring and looked through the observation window. The stars were unchanged. Genesis was still moving between them. There is no planet beneath us, no ground, no natural horizon, only the darkness of interstellar space. And yet, beneath my feet, there was weight again. Something humanity had spent its entire existence taking for granted had become something we deliberately created around ourselves. Gravity was no longer simply a force we lived beneath. It was part of the home we had built. And as Genesis continued toward the stars, I found myself wondering how many generations would eventually grow up aboard ships like ours, and whether one day artificial gravity would feel just as natural to them as Earth's gravity had once felt to us. The ring continued turning. Genesis continued onward. And beneath our feet, for now, there was gravity. Our journey comes to an end. For now. Thank you for traveling aboard the interstellar Starship Genesis. If you'd like to continue exploring the stars with us, please consider subscribing for future voyages. Until we meet again, sleep well and safe travels.